One of the world's largest mining firms has written a bill in the Florida legislature that would help the company dodge lawsuits related to radiation on its former mines and make it much easier for this company to develop some of its vast land holdings across the southern interior of the state. We know this as a result of the latest investigation from Seeking Rents, which we're going to tell you about right now. Hello, and welcome to Seeking Rents, the podcast. I'm your host, Jason Garcia. I am the publisher of Seeking Rents, which is a newsletter in Florida about state politics, but with a particular focus on the ways that big businesses and other special interests influence public policy in this state. That name, Seeking Rents, comes from a term in economics called rent seeking. And rent seeking is what's happening when someone with lots of wealth and influence, like a big business or a billionaire, uses their wealth and influence to get laws changed in their favor in a way that allows them to capture even more wealth and influence for themselves, usually at the expense of someone else. One of the world's largest mining firms has written a bill in the Florida legislature that would help the company dodge lawsuits related to radiation on its former mines and make it much easier for the company to develop some of its vast land holdings across the southern interior of Florida. So this is based on a number of public records that Seeking Rents has obtained over the last few months from the Florida Legislature, and it involves a company by the name of the Mosaic Company. This is a Fortune 500 corporation that mines for phosphate ore in central Florida and then processes it for fertilizer at chemical factories near Tampa. And those records show that lobbyists for the Mosaic Company gave state lawmakers the original draft of this legislation, which has been filed for the 2026 legislative session as House Bill 167, and which would effectively immunize Mosaic against certain kinds of legal claims under a tough environmental law. Mosaic's goal here is to essentially snuff out this lingering legal risk on more than 200 square miles of former phosphate mines it owns across 5 counties in Florida. And this is so the company can then redevelop that land, or more likely sell it off to other real estate developers who can build on it without any fear of future claims from homeowners who might later be exposed to elevated levels of radiation while living on this land. These records that we obtained also show that Mosaic has been working on this issue very closely with one of the most powerful people in Tallahassee, Ben Albritton, the president of the Florida Senate, and a Republican whose district includes most of Mosaic's land. Mosaic is one of the very largest campaign contributors in all of state politics. So campaign finance records show that Mosaic has given more than $500,000 to state candidates and political committees just during the first 9 months of this year. And that includes a $100,000 donation to a fundraising committee controlled by Republican leaders in the Florida Senate. This liability legislation is a top priority for Mosaic. In emails, company lobbyists have told legislators it is, quote, very important to Mosaic, and it appears to be on the fast track in Tallahassee. After this bill got caught up earlier this year in a budget dispute that derailed the 2025 legislative session, which was held earlier this year, but it has now been resurrected for 2026, and it has already been teed up for a full vote in the state house as soon as the first week of the next session, which begins just a few weeks from now in mid-January. So today we're gonna go through this stuff in detail, both what this bill would do, the laws it implicates, and how it would cut holes in this tough environmental law I mentioned, and just how much Mosaic and how exactly Mosaic has been throwing its lobbying muscle behind it. Before we get to that, just a quick reminder, please, if you can, click like and subscribe and leave a show rating or review. And if you haven't already, please think about signing up for a subscription to our newsletter too. Easiest place to find us is at seekingrentsfl.com. That'll redirect you to the Substack page, and signing up for a subscription there will get all our stories and podcasts emailed straight to your inbox. Subscriptions are free. None of our content is behind a paywall, but there is an option to voluntarily pay for a subscription if you can afford one. So, okay. With that out of the way, let's get back to the story. And I think the best place to start is one of the strongest environmental laws on the books in Florida is a statute known as the Water Quality Assurance Act. And this was first enacted nearly 40 years ago, and it imposes something known as strict liability on companies that release pollution into the ground or water. And what strict liability means is that a company that releases pollution can be forced to compensate any people or anybody that's impacted by that pollution, regardless of whether the release was accidental, was like the result of a pure accident, or whether or not the company actually did something wrong in releasing, they were careless or negligent somehow. And the idea here is to ensure that a corporation handling these like really dangerous materials that can sicken or poison or even kill people or wildlife, have the maximum financial incentive to be as careful as possible while handling those materials. And Mosaic has been trying to weaken the Water Quality Assurance Act for years. So, for instance, back during the 2024 legislative session, so about a couple of years ago now, Florida's Republican-controlled legislature nearly passed a bill that would have dramatically reduced the legal exposure that corporate polluters face under the Water Quality Assurance Act. This legislation ultimately failed to pass, partly because it drew like just intense opposition both from environmental groups and from lobbyists for personal injury trial lawyers, a number of attorneys that like whose business relies on practicing lawsuits under the Water Quality Assurance Act. That 2024 bill was pushed in public by a bunch of business front groups like the Florida Chamber of Commerce and Associated Industries of Florida. But the records obtained by Seeking Rents show that lobbyists for Mosaic were pushing it behind the scenes. So one example of this, after the 2024 session ended, one of the lawmakers that sponsored the legislation that year, a guy by the name of Toby Overdorf, a Republican state representative from Palm City, kind of the Treasure Coast area on the southeastern Florida. He expressed an interest in refiling that bill for the 2025 session. That was the session that was held earlier this year. But before he did, emails show Overdorf had one of his aides reach out to a lobbyist for Mosaic to check with them first and to literally ask if they had any updates to the legislation or if he should just go ahead and refile it as is. That Mosaic lobbyist responded by asking Overdorf not to file the bill at all, according to these emails we obtained through public records requests. And so Toby Overdorf never did. So, quote, "Please hold back for the time being," the Mosaic lobbyist wrote to Overdorf's aide, and this was in December 2024, so just very shortly in the months leading up to the 2025 session. "Some developments on this. We'll explain." Now, the lobbyist didn't ever elaborate in those emails about what these developments were, and neither he nor Overdorf would responded to requests for comment or to questions I sent them a while back now. But about 2 months later, that same Mosaic lobbyist gave lawmakers and staffers in both the House and the Senate a different bill to file for the 2025 session. This new proposal, it also punched a hole in the Water Quality Assurance Act, but a much narrower one, and one that was tailored specifically for a problem that Mosaic itself is facing right now. So in phosphate mining, companies dig up phosphate ore, which is typically buried between 20 and 50 feet below ground. They use these giant machines known as draglines to literally just like scrape the top of the land off the earth, basically. But once they have finished mining a site, mining companies are required by law to reclaim the land, which basically just means taking all the soil and sand and what they call overburden, which is basically everything on the top of the land. That's the trees, the greenery, in many cases, the wildlife, all the stuff they scraped off. They've got to, they put it back in and they refill all those trenches and canyons they kind of restore the land to at least something resembling its former state. The issue here is that phosphate ore contains uranium and radium, which are naturally radioactive. And this mining and then reclamation process leaves some of that radioactive material behind, except it is now much closer to the surface. And as a result, radiation levels are now much higher, or radiation levels are higher. There's dispute. The industry will tell you it's still within safe range, although, as we'll discuss, that is an issue in dispute. But radiation levels are higher on land that has been mined for phosphate. And that creates legal exposure for if homes or businesses are later built on this land. And that's actually the issue at the heart of a case known as Cruz versus Mosaic. This is a case that is currently working its way through Circuit Court in Hillsborough County, which is where the city of Tampa is. And in that case, residents of a pair of mobile home parks that were built atop former phosphate mines that are now owned by Mosaic, and they have sued Mosaic, alleging harm from radiation exposure.
This lawsuit claims that the levels of radiation that people were experiencing inside their own homes would be equivalent to if you were getting an X-ray once a week. Now, they are seeking damages, but there's no amount of money that could reverse the potential damage in their family's health.
The residents are seeking class action status, so this is a case that could get very large very fast, and they have asked the judge to hold Mosaic to strict liability under the Water Quality Assurance Act, among other legal claims in this. Strict liability is enormously important here. If you can use strict liability, all you have to show is that Mosaic caused the elevated radiation levels. You don't have to show that Mosaic did something negligent in doing so. It's just a virtue of it caused the contamination. You're not getting into an issue of negligence as well. This case has been kind of slowly grinding its way through state court for more than 5 years now, which, as you can imagine, this is like incredibly technical stuff when you're talking about radiation levels of radiation exposures and impacts. But there is enough merit to it that the judge presiding over it rejected an attempt by Mosaic to have it dismissed. It's a big enough threat to Mosaic that this company, a Fortune 500 corporation, has disclosed it, has warned its investors about it. And this is where that new legislation comes in. So this new bill would essentially create a new carve-out from the Water Quality Assurance Act for legal claims that arise from, quote, a substance that is part of the natural geography of a former phosphate mine. That is essentially an oblique way of saying radiation. The substance here is that uranium and radium that are naturally a part of phosphate ore, and that has been sort of left behind on this land that is now sort of more radioactive than it had been. And so by creating a carve-out in the Water Quality Assurance Act from this kind of substance that's a natural geology of a former phosphate mine, it means that someone living on a former phosphate mine who suffers some kind of harm from the elevated radiation levels on this land, radiation that again comes from the natural geology of phosphate ore, could no longer hold Mosaic to strict liability in a lawsuit. In other words, it would no longer be enough to prove that Mosaic simply caused the elevated radiation levels on this land. You would have to now prove that Mosaic was somehow negligent in doing so, and that is a much higher legal bar to clear in court. This is not all, by the way. This Mosaic's legislation would also erect even new hurdles to lawsuits that allege negligence too, that argue that the company did do something wrong in addition to it didn't just simply cause the elevated radiation, it did something wrong. And so we've alluded to this in some of the other podcasts where we've talked more quickly about this. But like, for instance, it sets a requirement that if you're going to sue Mosaic over radiation exposure, you got to go get a bunch of radiation tests done, or you got to get radiation tests done before you even file the lawsuit, which superficially seems to make sense, but it provides no mechanism to ensure you can have access to the land that you need to test. It is silent on the idea as if multiple people are suing. If you're trying to sue class actions, you have to get a pre-suit test done for every person that's potentially a part of the class. What do you do if some of this is on private land that you don't have access to, like if you're a tenant or something like that? All of this stuff it essentially creates this pre-litigation process where you're gonna you have to go through a lawsuit before you can file a lawsuit, and which drives up the cost of pursuing one of these cases, makes it much harder, gives more sort of out points for the defendant. It is a serious potential impediment to even a negligence lawsuit. And so these changes could absolutely cripple this case against Mosaic, that Cruz versus Mosaic lawsuit I mentioned, as well as a second lawsuit that has been filed just, I think, earlier this year, just a few months ago. And in that case is in Polk County, and it's against an engineering company that the plaintiffs say failed to safely remediate some former phosphate mining land and didn't adequately protect or get rid of the radiation on there. But it is important to understand here that the impact of this legislation would extend far beyond just these two lawsuits. Even if they become big lawsuits, even if they become class action suits for those areas, those are two isolated examples. This legislation goes far beyond that. And that is because Florida has more than 450,000 acres of current and former phosphate land around, mostly in south central Florida, kind of the part of the Florida, the interior part of Florida just south of Tampa Bay. and most of that land is now owned by Mosaic. Back in the day, there used to be a bunch of the phosphate mining industry. There used to be a bunch of players, but Mosaic has come to dominate the industry. It's been like forged through like mergers and acquisitions over the years, to the point where when you talk about the phosphate industry, mining industry in Florida, you are talking about Mosaic for the most part. And Mosaic put basically all of its lobbying muscle into this liability legislation during the 2025 session, again, which was held earlier this year, and when this bill was filed as House Bill 585 and Senate Bill 832. So these emails we obtained show, for instance, that the company arranged dozens of one-on-one meetings with legislators. It wrote and approved amendments to be made to the bill. When sponsors and legislative staffers were doing like technical amendments or trying to like clean up language, it had to be shown to Mosaic to get the green light on whether or not to do it. And if Mosaic objected, they made sure to address those Mosaic's concerns, even in any amendment they made. It also, obviously, it supplied lots of talking points and other promotional materials to legislators. One of the interesting things that came out of these like talking points and stuff is just how explicitly Mosaic was pitching this bill to legislators as a real estate development bill, basically positioning it as the key to unlocking the development potential of all this former phosphate mining land, which is in one of the most rural areas of the state. And so, like, one of the one pagers that the company would hand out said, quote, "Job creation and housing development rely on land that is available, affordable, and developable. Yet many lands that once supported phosphate mining have untapped potential due to legal uncertainty that limits reuse. By providing liability protections for the sale of previously mined phosphate lands, this legislation removes barriers to repurposing them for new opportunities." Those barriers, of course, are, potentially sickened future homeowners that can't sue or pursue any kind of legal accountability at that point. The other thing you found in these records, Mosaic would even feed friendly lawmakers arguments to use against opponents of this legislation and to fend off changes it did not want to make. So, like, for example, at one point during the 2025 session, Representative Lindsey Cross, a Democrat from St. Petersburg, tried to add a provision to the bill that would require anyone selling a home or renting a home on former phosphate mining land to provide disclosures directly to the new home buyer, the new tenant, like rather than just relying on them to sort of find it buried in, like, by searching themselves through public records or relying on some sort of title search firm to find it. This would have required direct disclosures and warnings to anybody basically moving into this land. Mosaic provided a bunch of talking points to use against that, and of course, Republicans in the legislature rejected the amendment, offered by a Democrat. Republicans have super majorities in both the House and the Senate. But the other interesting thing in these records is that Mosaic wasn't the only one who made this legislation a priority. So too did Ben Albritton, the president of the Florida Senate. And if you know anything about the Florida Legislature, you know that there are two people that basically run the show: the Senate president and the House Speaker. These are incredibly top-down driven chambers, and so you get the House Speaker, the Senate president to make your issue their issue. That is a really powerful thing to have in your back pocket as you're lobbying for stuff. And so, for instance, these records we obtained showed that lobbyists for Mosaic worked directly with Albritton's staff on the bill before it was even filed. So there's a bunch of calendar entries that show Mosaic lobbyists and executives meeting with staffers on the president's staff to work on the draft of the legislation in the Senate president's own conference room in the president's office on the fourth floor of the Florida Capitol. There was another interesting point. So late in the 2025 session, folks who listen to this podcast will remember that the 2025 session essentially like collapsed into chaos when there was a big fight initially between the House and the governor, and then later became the House and the Senate over the state budget and sort of just how deeply to cut taxes and whether or not to cut the statewide sales tax, which would have necessitated enormous cuts to the state budget. As things deteriorated between the House and the Senate, the House Speaker Danny Perez, Republican from Miami, essentially decided to like hold up the Mosaic bill. So like everybody in the House sort of knew this would have been a top priority for Ben Albritton. So like this becomes an obvious leverage point. And so what the House did was they grabbed the bill and they stuck a bunch of other stuff that they wanted to pass onto it with it. Stuff that Mosaic opposed and that the big business lobby didn't like. So basically, like, you've set up a situation where you're like, you're killing the bill by adding to it. And so when that happened, these records we got show that Mosaic lobbyists worked with Ben Albritton's staff to strategize a different bill they could commandeer themselves for their own legislation. This was, I actually remember when this happened. I think we even talked about it during one of our daily podcasts during the session. There was this bill moving through the legislature last year. It was just this like really arcane technical bill dealing with mitigation banks. And it suddenly got like grabbed in the Senate, in a Senate committee stop, and they just changed the title. The only thing of substance they did was they changed the title from an act relating to mitigation banks to an act relating to land development. And why that's important is any amendment to a bill has to be germane, right? So like if you can put a much wider title on a bill, it becomes available to all sorts of future amendments. And I remember when that happening, like I said, I think we even did a podcast about like that's a bright red flag. Something bad is coming, or something sneaky is coming on that bill. And sure enough, the Senate later stuck all of Mosaic's bill onto that legislation. And these records show Mosaic was the one orchestrating that behind the scenes. They identified the bill. They got the president's office to sort of greenlight the strategy of taking this mitigation bank and turning it into a phosphate mining radiation liability bill instead. Now, this budget stalemate ultimately doomed Mosaic's legislation in the 2025 session. So essentially, like I said, the session collapsed, and basically almost every policy bill that hadn't yet passed when it did, and that's most of the stuff important to leadership, it collapsed. Unless you could make a case that you were related to the budget and sort of like shoehorn yourself into a budget-related bill, which is exactly what lobbyists for billionaire Ken Griffin at Success Academy managed to do with the Schools of Hope legislation we talked about. That looked like it had died as well when the session collapsed, but then they managed to shoehorn themselves into a bill related to the state budget and got to pass when lawmakers finally finished their work. The Mosaic bill wasn't so lucky, and it collapsed like most other policy bills did last year. But it has been resurrected for the 2026 session, as I mentioned, as House Bill 167. And while we haven't yet seen this bill show up again in the state Senate, this new House bill is identical to the 2025 legislation, the 2025 bill that we know from these records Mosaic lobbyists wrote. The key difference here is now the House bill has an influential new sponsor too, and that's a guy by the name of Representative Larry McClure, who is a Republican from Plant City, and he chairs the House Budget Committee, which is essentially like probably the number 3 most important position in the chamber. And in each chamber, the most important person is the presiding officer, the House Speaker, the Senate President. The second most important person is the person who is going to be the next House Speaker or Senate President. The third most important person is the budget chair. And that's Larry McClure, and he is now personally sponsoring House Bill 167. McClure is a guy with a history of working with Mosaic lobbyists. Folks might remember a couple of years ago, Florida passed what critics called the radioactive roads bill, and that was a bill creating the way to test the use of a radioactive byproduct from Mosaic's chemical manufacturing process, creating a mechanism to test that substance as a material to be used in road building. Larry McClure sponsored that legislation that year, and then interestingly, I think it was the Tampa Bay Times that had a piece about this after the session ended. Mosaic threw him a pretty nice fundraiser, it seemed like, at a swanky golf resort the company used to own that it built on some of its former phosphate mining land, and that it uses as a base of operations when it's looking to woo policymakers sometimes. But after allowing Mosaic's bill to slip through the cracks last year, and I should say after allowing this, the House has now given it this new powerful sponsor, but also absolutely fast-tracked it this time around. So the House has already pushed this bill, House Bill 167, through 2 committee hearings, and the session hasn't even started. We've talked a lot about how every year the legislative session technically only lasts 60 days, or it's only supposed to last 60 days, but the legislature tries to get a lot of advance work done in these committee hearings, these like preliminary committee hearings during what they call committee weeks. During this year's committee weeks ahead of the 2026 session, the House has already pushed this Mosaic bill through all of its committees. It is now ready for a vote in the full state House, and session hasn't even begun yet. That means they could take it up and pass it out the first day of session if they wanted to. And session begins January 13th, so it is just around the corner at this point. And obviously, this is going to be one of the bills to watch. This one, to use an expression I think I used last one, clearly has legs. I mean, it's already on the brink of passing, and we haven't even technically gavelled session open yet. So Anyway, I'm gonna leave it there. Just a quick reminder again: if you're interested in this kind of content, if you find this illuminating or helpful, please click like or subscribe. Like and subscribe, I guess. Do both if you can. That'd be great. Leave show ratings, reviews. Those help grow the show. I'll throw into the show notes. I'm going to throw a couple of stories. This was based on a story we wrote on the newsletter, so I'll throw the written version of this story into the show notes as well. Also throw contact your legislator tabs, like if you want to reach out to folks, whether or not you're for or against this, you're on Team Mosaic, you're on, team radiation exposed homeowners, you can reach out to the legislature. I'll throw a link in there to help you find those if you're interested in taking any sort of action that way. And then also just one reminder too, if you haven't already, please think about signing up for a subscription to the newsletter itself. Easiest place to find us, seekingrentsfl.com. Subscriptions are free. Nothing is behind a paywall. None of our stories, podcasts, anything is behind a paywall. It's freely available to everyone. But there is an option to voluntarily pay for a subscription if you can afford one. If you got the means, please think about doing it. The revenue we get from these voluntary paid subscriptions is so important. It's how we pay for instance, how we cover the cost of like public records requests, like the ones that produced all the records that we cited, and that if you're watching this, you've hopefully seen a bunch of the screenshots. If you read the story, you'll see screenshots as well. It costs money to do big public records requests and pull some of these details, pin down some of these details. So your voluntary, the folks who choose to pay for their Seeking Rents subscriptions are just incredibly valuable to this cause. So, all right, with that, we'll leave it there, and we'll be back again very soon. We'll do, I think, at least one more show before the holiday, but on the off chance that I get distracted, I hope everybody watching or listening to this has a really wonderful holiday, and we'll talk again soon. Take care.